Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tom Lees, Key Relationship Manager from Lawyer Checker, and I'm joined by my colleague Jen Williams, Head of IT and Security at Lawyer Checker. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Tom.
Firstly, a big thank you to the Society of Licensed Conveyancers for allowing us to talk to you today. Jen and I are going to discuss a number of simple steps that conveyancing firms can take to mitigate the risk around online security and cybercrime, with the aim of giving you a number of practical takeaways that you can implement across your business. You'll see there's a chat functionality on the right hand side. So if you want to ask any questions, Jen is going to monitor that and answer those at the end of the webinar. In terms of what we're going to cover, so we're going to look at what Cyber Essentials is and where you start with choosing a Cyber Essentials Assessor, and actually what is involved in the accreditation process, as we know that there are a lot of questions that law firms have about that, and we'll hopefully be able to answer those for you. And we're also going to look at how you can stop a criminal impersonating your email address. We know that email modification fraud has been a major problem for conveyancing firms in the last few years. So we're going to look at something you can do to help mitigate the risk where that's concerned. We're also going to look at how do you monitor if your email passwords are available for sale on the dark web, and that we know that criminals buy and sell a lot of data on there. So we're going to talk to you about that. And then we're going to look at some educational resources that you can point your staff to help educate them. And I'll be able to share the links with you when I send you a copy of the slides. So I thought a good place to start is Cyber Essentials. Most of you will probably heard of Cyber Essentials now, which is a government-backed accreditation about demonstrating that you are strong in the core basics of cybersecurity. Jen, you're a Cyber Essentials Assessor. Do you want to go into a little bit more detail on sort of what Cyber Essentials is and where it really benefits firms?
Yeah, sure. So the whole reason that the National Cyber Security Centre introduced the Cyber Essentials scheme was to allow businesses of any size to be able to have a kind of benchmark that they could be certified against, and to show other businesses and their clients that they're covering the very basics of cybersecurity. Now, by the basics, we mean things like, are you using strong passwords, and are you using kind of secure configuration? Are you on an up-to-date operating system? Are you updating your applications regularly? So it's not about kind of getting really technical about cybersecurity. It's about implementing the basics really well. And the National Cyber Security Centre say that implementing the Cyber Essentials scheme will reduce your risk of a cyber attack by 80%.
And those of you who are familiar with the analogy of marginal gains, which is about doing the little things well, which ultimately add up to making a fundamental difference. One of the ways we view Cyber Essentials at Lawyer Checker is that this is a marginal gain. So it's a 1 or 2% thing that can make a significant impact when aligned with other things. In terms of where do you start with choosing an assessor? So Jen, we get a lot of questions from firms who maybe have been pointed in the direction of Cyber Essentials from their insurer, some Lexel assessors, a conveyancing quality scheme assessors as well, but they actually don't really know how to go about this. Do you want to sort of go into a bit of detail about the journey and where firms should start when it comes to choosing an assessor?
Yeah, sure. So as of April this year, there's only one kind of accreditation body that's allowed to administer the overall scheme, So the accreditation body is IASME, and that was chosen by the National Security Centre because it particularly targets itself at small and medium businesses, and that's where they wanted to target Cyber Essentials. So IASME then has a network of certification bodies that can all issue the Cyber Essential certificates. So the first step is to choose a certification body, and I'd always recommend choosing one that understands your industry, because there are some kind of language that you might use as a law firm that other industries won't be familiar with. So each assessor tends to have an industry that they're familiar with. So ours is obviously the legal sector. We already have lots of law firm clients. So when you're talking about case management systems, we understand what that means. So choosing one that understands your sector makes life a lot easier for you going through your accreditation.
And I think I come across a really interesting example last week where the firm's IT company were actually an approved assessment centre, but the firm were really cautious and didn't actually want to go through the assessment with them because they almost felt like they were marketing themselves. So I think having a fresh pair of eyes and having a genuine outsider mark that is quite a valuable tool. Is that fair, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing that you should try and avoid if possible is having somebody who's implemented the scheme actually responsible for marking it as well. So what we do at Lawyer Checker is we have a consultant who can help to implement, but then we also will assign that to a separate assessor to mark. And it avoids that scenario, like Tom said, marking your own homework.
And I think as a business, we come at this at quite a different angle to lots of other people. So it's important to remember that we're not an IT-based business, but we're not looking to make money off remedial work, or we're not going to charge you for the work that you might need to do to get ready. That's up to you to ultimately do. So we come across this as a slightly different angle in that the assessment and our experience in the legal sector is really where we come at Cyber Essentials. Whereas quite a lot of the businesses that we hear, Jen, are quite keen to make money from the remedial work side of things, and they're quite keen to charge sort of for extra work associated with that. We hear quite a lot of similar stories. I think I know I do. Is that what you hear as well?
Yeah, and I think in reality, there's probably not, to go for Cyber Essentials, there's probably not a great deal of remedial work to do for most firms. So yeah, I think that's fair. Do you know what I mean? We're not interested in doing your IT. What we'd rather do is help you to ask the right questions of your IT department and ask the right questions so that you understand as well where your risks might lie.
And just to give those firms who don't have the accreditation at the moment a sort of walkthrough, do you want to sort of talk through the process of accreditation, Jen, and sort of how that looks from start to finish?
Yeah, and it's actually really straightforward, which is great, and it's something that IASME have worked really hard to make straightforward for all kinds of businesses. So once you say yes, we want to go through the process of getting certified, we'll give you some help documents. So we'll give you kind of some guidance on where you might need to make some changes. You then get access to an assessment portal. So we send you some credentials, you log into the portal, and there are a series of questions that you need to answer about your IT infrastructure and about some of your processes. Once you're happy that you've answered everything, you just click the submit button and we are sent that assessment to mark. If when we mark the assessment there's nothing that needs changing, then we just issue your certificate straight away. If there are any areas that we think maybe you need to modify something, or you might need to just update your wording, for example, you'll get a report with that feedback on it, and you'll be given the chance to resubmit that a second time where you'll pass.
And in terms of the benefits of Cyber Essentials, I think there's a number of different benefits that you'll see from this. Number one, if you've got your the professional indemnity insurance coming up in October, I think this is something that would be really valuable to get in your cover letter. And we can sort of help you with the wording behind that and help you explain to a broker or an insurer about what that has looked at, etc. I also think it's a really good sort of message to have as a business. So to communicate that not only to your clients, but to the businesses that you're working with is a really powerful tool. It shows that you take cybersecurity seriously. And from a criminal perspective, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in a bit more detail, but if you're a criminal and you're looking to target a firm and you can see that they display a confident, outgoing message, that they're strong around cybersecurity, they might use good levels of technology, for example, the different types of ID technology that there is out there. If you can show that, it's quite likely that criminals will just try and find an easier target, because there'll be plenty of easier targets for them to go at. That's for certain. You've sort of studied criminal behavior a bit more than me, Jen, in terms of your role, but from what we know about criminals, they really focus quite hardly on sort of targeting, especially in the legal sector, that they're easy prey, really, don't they?
Exactly. So if you think about a criminal who's essentially running a very illegitimate business of their own, so they're looking at the same kind of things that legitimate businesses are looking at. So they're looking at how much money can they make from you, and how much are you going to cost them to attack. So it's just a simple profit calculation. So if you make yourself difficult for them to attack, then they'll just move on to the next person who isn't so difficult. And it's actually your Cyber Essentials certificate is searchable by anybody. So you'll be able to a criminal will be able to search to see if you have Cyber Essentials or not. And if you do, they'll know that those kind of basic controls, that they can't attack you in those really simple ways.
And from the work that we've done over the last nearly 2 years now, since you've been an assessment body, we know that the accreditation process is suitable for firms of all sizes, whether you're a sole practitioner or you've got 50 people working for you, it really doesn't matter. It's suitable for all. I think sometimes accreditations scare people, and hopefully what we've done in the last 5 minutes is break down a little bit of the barrier in terms of that word accreditation and sort of what's involved within that.
So IASME have deliberately made the scheme accessible for even the smallest of business, and that was part of the reason why the National Cybersecurity Centre chose them to run the scheme going forwards.
And you may have also heard about something called Cyber Essentials Plus. Cyber Essentials Plus is a more in-depth version of Cyber Essentials, which effectively involves an assessment being carried out normally by Jen, who would do a vulnerability scan and then provide a detailed report based on that vulnerability scan. That can be done remotely, which is pretty straightforward to do. We've done a few of those in new and challenging COVID times. In terms of how much you should budget, Cyber Essentials is a yearly fee. So it's £300 plus VAT, and you hopefully get that assessed annually. Cyber Essentials Plus is £1,200 plus VAT. It does carry a little bit more weight because obviously the vulnerability scan will go into more detail. And I suppose the principle behind that is that from a conveyancing point of view, you'd audit your files, you would audit your account. What you're effectively doing there is replicating the audit alongside the IT element of the business. So moving on, we're now going to talk a bit about email modification fraud. So hopefully, I say hopefully, lots of you will be aware of this, and I'm sure many of you will have seen real life examples. So where you've had an email come into your inbox, which looks like it appears as a genuine email from another solicitor, but it is in fact not actually that person. Or as a business, you may have been a victim of this yourself. So you may have had a criminal impersonate your email address and obviously email this to clients. And I suppose that is really the key area of risk that we want to focus on today, is that if a criminal can impersonate your email address, it's not necessarily going to other solicitors or internally that will be the critical damage, although it could be. It's what happens when that email is sent to a client and what that client does with that. We've seen a whole heap of case studies over the last 12 months where individuals have paid their deposit funds to fraudsters because of this type of attack. Jen, do you want to put a bit more context around sort of email modification fraud and what the criminal is looking to achieve from this before we delve into how they can protect themselves against it?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think the main point to make here is, I think in times gone by, we've seen lots of phishing attacks where the email has been modified slightly, the email address has been modified slightly. So the criminal might use a 1 instead of an L to be able to trick the recipient into just glancing and thinking that was come from a legitimate email. Now, if I was a criminal and I'm going to set up this attack, there's quite a few steps I need to go through. So I need to buy a domain. I need to register the domain. I need to set up a email sending service. I need to construct my email. And that's kind of about 2 to 3 hours work for a good criminal, so to speak. I don't know a better way to put that. But for a criminal to actually send an email from your exact email address takes around 3 minutes. And it will never, ever pass through your infrastructure. So it means that somebody could be emailing your clients and actually you won't know until the client picks the phone up and says, I don't know, is this from you? But they might never do that. The first you might hear of it is them sending their deposit to the wrong account and then phoning you to ask where on earth their money's gone. So yeah, that would be my first point, is it's so ridiculously easy to do. And we demonstrate this to firms all the time. We will actually spoof their email address and we send ourselves an email from one of your email addresses just to show how easy it is to do. And the criminals might be looking for anything. They might be looking for those deposit funds. They might also be looking for some personal data. So it's not all about getting the money straight away. It might be that they send an email that says, "Oh, can you just remind me what your contact details are?" Or "Can you just remind me the address of this?" So they're getting little bits of data that they can put together at a later point.
And last year, I know a number of the insurers were talking about the fact that they were seeing more and more criminals reverting to the telephone to complete the journey of fraud. So what you said there, Jen, it might be the impersonation is at the start, but the actual sort of journey of the fraud is ended via a phone call or something like that. I know there was a big spike in that towards the back end of last year and the start of this year. And I think one of the key principles, and this is quite a common discussion now around risk management, is where do we draw the line? So when is enough? And I think in this instance, you've got to demonstrate, I think, that you can protect what is yours. Ultimately, going back to that example Jen just gave, is that if a criminal changes your domain dramatically and sends an email to a client, there's frankly not a great deal that you can do about that. But if it is your exact email address, there is something you can do about it. And Jen, what is it that firms can do to protect themselves from this?
Okay, so in a kind of as non-technical way as I can, they can implement something called DMARC on their domain. Now, I'm not going to make any bones about the fact that this is a kind of difficult thing to do. Most IT people won't have seen this before, but there is a setting that you can put on your DNS, which is where your domain is hosted, called DMARC, and that will actually stop a criminal from being able to send an email from your exact email address. One of the things that we offer firms is we actually offer that service where we will configure your DMARC for you. And we'll work with your IT team or your IT provider or whoever hosts your website and your emails. And we'll actually get this all set up so that it protects your domain from this type of spoofing attack.
And Jen, you mentioned about doing a spoofing test. On the right-hand side of your screens, on the chat option, there should be a poll button at the top, where we've asked you if you'd like a free spoof test, so we can see how easy it is to impersonate your email. If you'd like to do that, just click yes on that, and we'll happily sort of arrange that for you.
Clarify as well, Tom, that we're not hacking anybody's email address, so there's no kind of risk of damage of us doing this at all. It's literally just to demonstrate the problem of spoofing.
And that's, I think, where people often, terminology wise, get things a bit confused in terms of hacking, and because quite often a simple email impersonation they won't necessarily have got on the inside. They can have done that from the outside, and I think that's quite a big common misinterpretation. There are other areas of email impersonation that are a bit more challenging. Jen, talk about what firms can do if they've got Office 365, which is quite a good layer of protection if a criminal has managed to get hold of a password, for example.
Yeah, so passwords are stolen and guessed all the time, and I think we hear lots of examples of really kind of poor password choices where they're really easily guessable. One thing you can do, other than choosing a secure password, well, in addition to, is turn on two-factor authentication. And most of us are now used to using two-factor authentication, especially if we do things like online banking. So banks won't just rely on your password. They'll also text you a code or ask you for your fingerprint or ask you for a separate PIN number. That's two-factor authentication. So within Office 365, I would highly recommend that you turn on two-factor authentication for all of your accounts. And all that means is if a criminal manages to guess your password or manages to buy it from the dark web, more on that later, you've actually got that extra layer of protection because they don't have that second piece of information that they need to log into your account.
And I think there's also a lot of firms who'll be listening and watching this that hear quite a lot now about email encryption and encrypted emails. This is obviously slightly different to what we're talking about around email modification fraud, but it seems sensible to touch on it. I think we know of a number of firms that use email encryption. Do you just want to talk about encryption and sort of where that sits and what benefits that gives firms, Jen?
Sure. I think the best analogy I can use to describe email encryption is if you think about email in terms of the old-fashioned postal system. So sending an email unencrypted is like sending a postcard. So it can be easily read. You don't know who's gonna receive it. If you're sending your data encrypted, it's like having a recorded delivery. So you know where it's going to go to, you know that nobody else is going to be able to read that information, and you know that the person, once they've signed for it, can open the letter and read the data that's in it. So that's the best way for me to describe encryption. You should never, ever be sending personal data that's unencrypted, because there's a risk that could be read by somebody who it isn't intended for.
And I know that we've seen over lockdown a lot of firms start to use email encryption for helping around documents, signatures, and things like that. So I think it's starting to infiltrate the market and will continue to do so over the next few years. That's why I thought it's well worth us spending a little bit of time just explaining some of the differences between that and what we're talking about in terms of email impersonation. Our own research shows that 72% of all cybercrime reports to the SRA last year were made up of email modification fraud. So we know it's still a major challenge. And after we conducted some of our own research of 100 law firms, we discovered that 94% of those we spoke to didn't have the DMARC protocol correctly enabled, leaving the majority of those firms at risk from email impersonation. So we know that that's still very similar. There's been a small improvement since we've done that, which not too long ago, but we ultimately know that that's a constant challenge and a constant work on. One of the biggest sort of comments that we get around email impersonation is around outsourced IT. So they often deal with multiple sectors, and Jen spoke a little bit about this earlier. So they might not necessarily be familiar with some of the terms in the sector and some of the actual specific threats to you. And quite often, a lot of outsourced IT people will tell law firms that they have DMARC switched on. But when you actually look at it, and this is a key part of it, you can actually view as how secure someone's domain is and whether they have this correctly implemented. We then often see that that's not the case. So going back to what that criminal would do, this is exactly the type of thing that they'll be looking at. So they'll look at whether you've got DMARC on your domain, and they'll try and understand that before deciding on how they decide to attack you. If you're fully secured up and locked up, then the chances are they're going to try a much easier target, because where this is concerned, there will be a lot of easier targets. One of the benefits of sort of doing the spoofing test is you might also look to do things like phishing testing. And we've done a number of phishing tests before with some of the firms that we work with. And I think phishing tests is a great way to help educate your people. So what we've really talked about in the webinar so far is a lot of the technical protocols that can help mitigate the risk around online security and cybercrime. But it's really important that we don't underestimate the value of people and the value of training them well and actually engaging them with this type of thing rather than them seeing it as a box ticking exercise. Jen, what, in your experience, when we've done phishing testing in the past, what do you sort of normally see that firms can pick up and take away on the back of this?
Okay, so I think firstly, the way we do phishing is again specific for law firms. So we don't just send out generic templates. We'll actually ask you what kind of systems do you use so that we can make those phishing attempts look like they're fairly genuine, but with enough red flags in there so that people should be able to spot them. Inevitably, somebody will click the link and enter their password. I think we're yet to do a phishing test where that hasn't happened. Secondly, it really helps firms to determine who their highest risk members of staff are, who maybe need that extra bit of training. And it's not always the staff that you would consider to be high risk. So I think most firms would, or most businesses would consider people like their CEOs and their accounts department to be high risk. Have you thought about secretaries or receptionists? Because they actually quite often will have a lot of the information that criminals find valuable, yet we may not have identified them as high risk. So these kind of phishing tests are great for pointing that out. They also point out some really positive things. So I've had a number of firms who've said, oh yeah, my staff know nothing about security, so I want to test them with a phishing test. And actually they've been pleasantly surprised that more than they thought have identified it as a phishing attack. But we can tell you, if we run a phishing simulation for you, we can tell you who's opened the email, who's clicked on any links that we put in there, and if anybody has entered their credentials into the false landing page that we can put up. And it serves as a great conversation starter and quite often a shock for some people to say, gee, I put my password in there, imagine if that was a genuine phishing attack. And it's quite often, like Tom says, that shock into engaging with the rest of your cybersecurity awareness training.
And I think we haven't mentioned the C word yet, so I haven't thrown COVID into the mix. But COVID has changed the way businesses are working. So people are now working from home far more frequently. So whereby they might just previously ask someone who was sat next to them, for instance, they don't have the comfort blanket of that anymore. And there's an argument to say that around this type of thing, people might feel more relaxed in their own environment, and therefore they might be more likely to do something like this. So I think that sits quite nicely with the whole working from home piece, and will give you a good overview of where you sit where that's concerned. I could pick probably one of 100 case studies where money has gone missing because of email modification fraud. This was one from the back end of last year, whereby the fraudsters had intercepted emails between the first-time buyer and their conveyancer. They forged the law firm's email to make it look authentic, and they sent the couple bank details, and the couple duly paid that in and lost their money. And at the time of that story, you'll see that the police were investigating. I think on a wider education piece around that, it's really important for you as a business to talk about how you communicate to your clients what your bank details are. Now, there's different ways of doing that, of course. You may have them in your initial client care letters. You may store them securely in a portal. You may only tell people over the phone. But I think it's really important that you look to mitigate and make that as safe as possible where you can, because that's quite an easy thing to get right. And one of the things I encourage my clients to do is don't be afraid to talk to your client about it early on. So just say, it might only take 10-20 seconds, but just say, look, this is how we're going to send you our bank details. They won't change during the course of the transaction. If you get any communication suggesting that they do, please can you let us know immediately? It's likely to be fraud. That's all you have to say. And I think that way you've demonstrated, going back to what I said earlier, you've really done as much as you can do. People often ask us, well, the idea of DMARC is great, and you've got a product that can implement it, brilliant, but what's actually involved and how long would this take? Jen, you manage our team that delivers this, so you're probably best placed to answer this one.
Okay, should we start with what's involved? What's involved is we go through a period of configuration. So we could just switch this on day one, but what we'll find then is some of your legitimate emails aren't being delivered. So we're really careful to go through that period of configuration in such a way where your legitimate emails are delivered and anything that shouldn't be delivered isn't delivered, which is why it takes a little bit of time for us to implement it. We'll have a series of conversations with either your IT team or your hosting provider to get your records set up correctly in the portal and in your DNS settings. And there's a few variables which influence how long it's going to take. So number one is quite straightforward, and it's communication time. So we understand that your IT providers and your IT teams are fairly busy. So sometimes it can take a little bit of time for us to get responses. Because the platform works off large amounts of data, and it learns from its own data as it goes along. The more email you have flowing through your domain, so the busier your domain is, the quicker we can configure it, just because quiet domains have less data passing through them, so we've got less data to make those decisions on. Another one is how complicated your infrastructure is. So if you use lots of different email sending services, like you might use Office 365, you might use MailChimp for marketing, you might have notifications going out of a case management system. Having lots and lots of those services can make it slightly more complicated to implement, but roughly it's about 6 weeks for a typical infrastructure that has a reasonably busy domain.
Budget-wise, we would advise you to budget £250 plus VAT per active domain. That doesn't mean each individual's email address. That just means how many emails you've got which are different after the @ sign. Most firms have 1, 2 max. Don't see very many with more than that. And then the monthly cost for the product and the ongoing protection, because it's the product that effectively does the great deal of the work, will be based on the number of email users. But if you have less than 50 email users, it's £75 plus VAT a month. And if you don't have Cyber Essentials, one of the things that we do offer is cyber packages. So we can include Cyber Essentials with this, and we can spread the cost of that out over a year. So you're paying a monthly fee for that. That's quite good if you're a small business. We touched upon this a little bit earlier in terms of criminals selling and buying information on the dark web. Those of you that have ever attended any National Cyber Security Centre events where they've come along to legal events would have probably heard of this mentioned before. Jen, talk us through what is the dark web, and why is it important that firms are monitoring what is for sale of theirs on that?
Okay, so as simply as I can, the dark web is an area of the internet, if you like, where the pages don't appear in Google, and you have to have a specific browser and a specific skill set to be able to access it. For that reason, it makes it really difficult for crime agencies to monitor what's happening on the dark web. And so it's a nice place, if you like, for criminals to be able to trade all kinds of unsavory things, amongst them being stolen credentials. So what most people don't realize is when a criminal is trying to harvest your email address and password, it's probably not for their own use. It's probably so that they can sell it in bulk lists on the dark web. So a criminal will simply browse to the dark web, place an order, pay in Bitcoin, and receive a whole list of email address and password combinations that they can use in a variety of services. So that's what happens on the dark web. Now, because not many of us visit the dark web on a regular basis, it's really difficult to know actually if your credentials have been stolen and have been listed for sale on the dark web. So what we offer is a monitoring service. So we can actually alert you to any credentials related to your domain, so anything after the @ symbol on your email address, that become listed for sale on the dark web. And in addition to that, we can tell you how to stop them being used against you.
And we've seen from when we've sort of done this in the past to firms, and we've actually shown them sort of we've plugged in one email address and it's brought up 6 or 7 instances where that's been available. It's actually very rare that we'll sit in front of a firm and maybe go through multiple domains and not see anything. I think that's pretty fair assessment. We see a lot of these available when we've done this before, don't we?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily even just work emails. So one of the things that I'm really careful to tell our staff about is never ever use the same password for something you use at home and something you use at work, because it's really easy for criminals to link those profiles together. So for example, in 2018, MyFitnessPal was hacked, and lots of email address and password combinations were stolen and are now for sale on the dark web. We know that list is for sale. Now, it doesn't take a criminal long to work out doing jenwilliams@gmail.com, which doesn't exist, jenwilliams@gmail.com, a quick search of LinkedIn, and you'll find out that I work at Practical Vision. So jenwilliams@practicalvision.co.uk is the same person, and the likelihood is, if I'm an average member of the public, that I use the same password at home and at work. So it's not just about your work passwords being stolen. This is really useful for kind of making that link between home and work as well.
And from a trigger point, that would obviously trigger the firm to make sure that people have changed their password. And and have implemented something on the back of that. In terms of the cost, so we offer the service, which is hopefully pretty cost effective, which is £25 plus £25 plus VAT per month per active domain. Again, it's rare that we see multiple domains used amongst sort of smaller conveyancing firms. We talked a little bit about people earlier on, but we're going to finish off by talking about the importance of people, and we're going to share some resources that you can use that will help educate your staff. Before I talk about staff specifically, Jen, I know you're quite passionate about not forgetting the IT people, and almost, because I think we often see this where managing partners or directors will automatically assume their IT people are cyber experts. And as a rule, that's not often the case, is it?
No, so obviously I hold two hats within our organisation. So I am the head of IT, but I've also kind of cross-trained at a later date to do security. But most of the IT people that certainly we recruit and I encounter in businesses aren't cybersecurity experts. And there is a misconception that if you know IT, you must know security. The thing I would liken this to is if you're going into hospital for surgery, you want a specialist in the area that you need surgery in. IT teams are great at keeping your infrastructure up and running. They're great at making sure that you're spending as little as possible on your infrastructure and that it works and allows you to send emails. What they're often not specialists in is making sure that the security works for your business and that the security arrangements that you have in place actually cover those broad range of risks that you might have identified that you have. So security is a specific field that sits along IT, and yes, they absolutely have to work together, but it's very rarely the same person who is the specialist in both.
And moving on to the more people side of things, I think there's lots of different things you can make sure that your staff are engaged with. The obvious one around other law firms that you're dealing with is SRA scam alerts. So those of you familiar with Lawyer Checker will have probably seen some of these in Lawyer Checker further research results. I'm always quite surprised at how many people aren't familiar with the SRA scam alerts. They're a really useful tool in terms of picking up fraudulent alerts against law firms. For instance, in the middle of COVID-19, we saw a massive spike in the scam alerts of law firms having their websites impersonated, and quite legitimate and reasonably sized law firms as well. And they were pretty good attempts at website impersonation. So that was quite an interesting one you can pick up from things like that. One that you might have read before is the National Cyber Security Centre's legal sector report. So they did this towards the back of the 2018, and that's still just as relevant now. I feel like the threat is very similar, and the type of challenges faced by yourselves as conveyancing businesses hasn't differed too much.
I just is the legal sector were the first sector that the National Cyber Security Centre did this for. So they specifically identified that the threat level to the legal sector was significantly higher than the rest of the UK economy. And that's why they thought it was worth spending all that time and money on this report.
In the last 2 months, the Yorkshire and Humberside cyber unit have put, I think conveyancing fraud was second on the list of about 7 threats that they considered priority, and conveyancing fraud I think was number 2 on that list. So that gives you an indication that they're still just as serious about this at that level. The password guidance, Jen talked a little bit in terms of the importance of good password policy. What we would encourage you to do is follow the National Cyber Security Centre guidance where this is concerned. This is regularly updated. it's really clear, and make sure that you've engaged with that, read it. The way the National Cyber Security Centre write these things is not over technical, so we're not bombarding you with a heap of technical information here. It's going back to what Jen said earlier, it's designed to be user friendly for small businesses. Jen, do you want to mention briefly the recent invention around phishing emails that they've brought in around the reporting of that?
Yeah, just if I can on the passwords, one of the really interesting pieces of guidance that was released by the National Cyber Security Centre was around, and this might surprise some people, but they changed the advice on updating passwords. So no longer are you advised to update your password every 60 days. And that's just because the National Cyber Security Centre recognised that encourages people to choose weaker passwords because they've got more and more to remember. So the current guidance on password reset is to only change a password if you feel like that password may have been compromised. For example, it's appeared in a dark web monitoring search. Yeah, the National Cyber Security Centre have started a service now where you can actually report suspicious emails to them and receive some advice on whether or not this is a legitimate email or not. There are lots of tools out there as well that you can use yourself to scan attachments, but I definitely recommend having a look at that service. If you are a Cyber Essentials customer of ours as well, we have access to a similar service that IASME run, who are the accreditation body, where they will actually look into suspicious emails and give some guidance on whether or not they are legitimate or they're safe to be opened.
And interestingly, on that note, I had in my Lawyer Checker inbox this morning 3 very suspicious emails that I've actually reported to this, which relate to a law firm that's recently gone bust. So I had 3 emails purporting to be from 3 different individuals, one saying their broker had recommended them to us, one said they were basically asking for a quotation, one saying their broker had recommended, one saying a friend, and they all referenced this firm that had recently closed, which shows you exactly what criminals do in the background. They know that this firm have recently closed, and they're looking to use that as a way to gain leverage. So I thought that was one that was well worth mentioning, and I've sent those emails off this morning. And then the last one is they offer a free training portal for staff, which is really simple for them to do. It's literally you click on that link and it brings up the training program, which should take your average member of staff about 15-20 minutes to do. I will make sure that for those of you who've attended and for those of you who are watching this on a recording, that you receive a copy of the slides so you have access to these links. And that's pretty much it from us. Hopefully you found what we've had to say useful, and we're giving you some things to think about in terms of some helpful takeaways. I put Jen and mine's contact details up on the screen, and I'll leave them there. So if you want to give us a ring and talk to us about anything, or you want to ask us any questions, you're more than welcome to do so. A big thank you again to the Society of Licensed Conveyancers for allowing us to present today. I think Jen and I are well aware of how busy conveyancing firms are at the moment and how challenging the last few months have been. But I think as the rest of the year is likely to be really busy, we unfortunately know that means a market where criminals will operate quite heavily. So it's still an important thing to be factoring into your planning over the next few months. Have there any questions that I've not seen that have come up? Let me just go back here. Okay, no, that's great. So Jen, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully everyone's found that interesting. We'll send out a recording if you'd like to share this with staff as well, which will pop up on our YouTube channel. And thank you very much for your time, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.